Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Lori Tellerico, the Adult Community Engagement Coordinator here at San Francisco Public Library. Thank you for joining us for today's program. Before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping items. Food and drinks are not permitted in the program space. Thank you for helping us take care of the room and the equipment. There is an all-gender restroom on this level located to your right as you exit the auditorium. There are additional restrooms located on the first floor past the elevators. In the event of an emergency, please note the nearest exit, which is located at the back of the auditorium. Staff will be available to assist if needed. This program is being recorded. If you prefer not to be on camera, we recommend seating towards the back and sides of the auditorium. Before we begin our program, I'd like to pause and ask for your attention for a brief land acknowledgement. The San Francisco Public Library acknowledges that we occupy the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. We recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. As uninvited guests, we affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples and wish to pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community. Welcome to today's program. In the spirit of Lunar New Year, a season of renewal, remembrance, and storytelling, we're delighted to welcome you. Today we have 4 local authors who have come together to talk about how cultural traditions, folklore, and heritage shape magical fiction. We'll explore how writers reimagine history, weave myth into contemporary stories, and build fantastical worlds rooted in tradition while speaking to modern readers. We're thrilled to be joined by these 4 authors today. The first author we have is Yangsze Choo, whose novels The Foxwife, The Ghost Bride, and The Night Tiger blend history, folklore, and richly imagined worlds. Julie Leong is the best-selling author of The Teller of Small Fortunes and The Keeper of Magical Things, writing warm magical fiction inspired by heritage. Aimee Phan is the author of The Re-Education of Cherry Trong and We Should Never Meet, an award-winning writer whose work explores history, memory, and Vietnamese-American experience. And finally, our moderator today is Julia V. Julia is a lifelong library lover and the author of the urban fantasy series, the Phoenix Horde Trilogy. The first book in the series, Ebony Gate, features swords, dragons, and a secret library hidden inside SFPL. Maybe Julia can show us where it is after the program. Thank you all for being here with us to celebrate this storytelling tradition. Let me welcome our authors to the stage now.
Oh, hey. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's lovely to see you all. This is a beautiful venue. Can you hear me? Okay. All right, I was given strict instructions about this mic, this chair, and all the things. First of all, Happy New Year to everybody. One of the things I wanted to propose this panel for was just an opportunity to get together and talk about magical stories during this time of year. Usually it's a time we gather with family, but also like when we write our stories, I think we're putting a little piece of ourselves and our lives into our books. And so I gave an outline to my fellow panelists, but one thing I told them to do was think about describing their books in 1 or 2 sentences for everyone in the room. Do you want to start, Julie?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Julie Leong. I have 2 books out. The first is called The Teller of Small Fortunes. It is a cozy fantasy about an immigrant fortune teller on the run who makes a living in her wagon with her mule, kind of just telling small prophecies. But she's hiding a dark secret, and she gets roped into the search for a lost child with a retired mercenary, a semi-retired thief, and a baker. I would describe it as sort of Studio Ghibli meets Lord of the Rings. And my second book is set in the same world, different characters, and that's more like Stardew Valley with lesbian mages.
Hello everyone, I'm Yangsze Choo, and I've written 3 books. So my first novel, The Ghost Bride, which is also a Netflix series, is set in colonial Malaya, and it's about a young woman who receives an offer of marriage from the son of the wealthiest family in town. And the only problem is he's dead. So it's about the Chinese custom of ghost marriages. And my second novel, The Night Tiger, which was a Reese Witherspoon book club pick, is also set in colonial Malaya, and it's about weird tigers and a murder mystery. My third novel, The Foxwife, is set in Manchuria. I really have lots of difficulty summing up these books because they're so peculiar. And it's a detective story told from the point of view of a fox and a detective.
My name is Aimee Phan. I've written 2 books of literary fiction, We Should Never Meet, a collection of short stories, and The Re-Education of Cherry Chung, which is a novel. And both of those books are for adults and deal with the consequences of war for the Vietnamese diaspora. My latest book, The Lost Queen, is my young adult fantasy debut and explores the mythology of 2 ancient Vietnamese queens who are reincarnated as teenagers in San Jose, California. And they discover that their mischievous Chinese brothers, the Han warriors, are also in the high school and trying to hunt them down. And so that's my 3rd book. Thank you.
I'm really enjoying Lost Queen. I love that it's set in San Jose, but also it reminded me that like one of the things as diaspora writers is that we're always exploring these spaces between worlds, whether it's like your home where you might speak a different language or your school or transportation across a magical land. I feel like each of the books that you guys have mentioned, certainly the modern fiction ones, we like to play with these liminal spaces. And I was very curious about whether or not you consciously did that in your works. And let's start with you, Aimee, because I feel like the pool is like a special place in your books.
I think I was always fascinated by the myth of the Chung sisters, which is about, this is a myth that the country reveres. There are temples, there are statues, there are festivals for these 2 sisters. And so I knew I always wanted to explore the story, the fact that Vietnam is actually a matrilineal society. And I was looking for a space where I didn't really hear about this story growing up. And so I needed to create like this pathway to be able to access this story. And I think reincarnation is a wonderful fantasy. It's a lovely idea to be able to imagine a connection with your ancestors, with your culture, with your tradition. And so to be able to have my characters kind of literally enact that they are part of this, that they are actually part of this myth was really, it became really inspiring in terms of telling the story that, they're not just inspired by these women, but they actually are them, and that they can derive this power and this tradition from their mythology.
I love the parallel world. Like she's in the pool and then she's actually in the sea, right? And her feet are touching the sand, and then she's somebody else. She's her ancestral self, right? I also noticed Yangsze and the fox wife. It is a real literal travel story. This fox is going quite far. It's like a quest. I felt like a hobbit reading it. Did you know it was going to take that sort of journey aspect when you were writing?
No, I didn't, because I didn't write an outline. But I do think the idea of, first of all, I had set the fox wife in Manchuria, and the reason why halfway through the book they get on a boat and go to Japan is because of COVID. And what happened is I'd gone to China for one visit to do research, and I was planning to go back again when COVID hit. Everything shut down, and so I was like, oh no. But I spent part of my childhood in Japan, and so I was like, well, I know this area and it has a historical significance to Manchuria, so they can all get on a boat and go to Mochi, which any of you goes to Japan, I highly recommend it. It's very interesting. So that's what happened with that. But I do think, as Aimee was saying, like stories take on very unexpected twists and turns to places that you never expect. And the journey itself, I think, reveals a lot about the characters.
Yes, and for you, I feel like in your first book, it takes place in a caravan. They're really on a journey. Did you make a map? Did you do any of these special things that authors like to do in the beginning?
I did not make a map. I really wish I had, and I've had many people ask me why I don't have a map. I am a little bit geographically challenged, and so my characters tend to just travel in a cardinal direction for much of the book. They're just heading northeast. Don't worry about where. But yeah, that was very much an intentional thing. I think and we'll probably touch on this a bit later, but my character is an immigrant. And so she is coming from an Asian coded culture inspired by China, but finding her way in this kingdom that is more Western European in inspiration that she was brought to as a young child. And so she's run away from kind of the life that's been set up for her. And as a result, she is living in this wagon, which is in of itself sort of a liminal space. And I think she's quite literally carrying her home with her wherever she goes. And a lot of her arc in the book is about kind of her search for finding a place that feels like home. And so, yeah, I feel like traveling is, both practically speaking as a writer, a very easy way to show more facets of your world, and also a way to kind of reveal the things that are constant within the character as they're moving through different places.
Yeah, and I love that as she travels, she's gathering this band of misfits together with her, and they're adding a little bit something extra cozy to her life, right? And even a baker, which I feel is mandatory.
You've got to have a baker in your party.
Cozy, right? Although, does the baker improve?
The baker, I think she improves. I'm not sure how you'd measure the improvement. Her stuff always tasted good. It just wasn't pretty, which was, for those of you wondering, directly inspired by my adventures with sourdough baking during the pandemic.
As you can tell, I think the lockdown had a profound effect on our books and our storytelling, even in unexpected ways. I mean, we couldn't travel, and book 2 was set, Bloodshade was set in Tokyo. And so we would find ourselves on YouTube watching videos of people going into the 7-Eleven, or people like taking the metro. And it felt like a fantasy land, actually, to see them living their life in a normal way, right? And I think also for me as a diaspora person to see, oh, this is what it's like where you live somewhere where you look like everybody else. Which, for our books, sometimes our character feels like a stranger, right? Like you were saying, she is away from her homeland, right? What choice did you make or choices that you might have made to bring those elements of, okay, this is China coded. How can I add a little bit more into this story, Julie?
Yeah. So I knew from the beginning that I wanted the character to kind of speak to my own childhood experience. I grew up in suburban New Jersey where it wasn't like San Francisco. There actually weren't a lot of other Asians around. And so I always felt a little bit out of place. But when I was older as a teenager, I moved to Beijing, China with my parents. And like you're saying, it was very strange and wonderful to be in a place where everybody looks like you. But at the same time, I very much didn't fit in there either. I was too American for China, too Chinese for America. And so I knew I wanted to write a character that kind of embodied those things, because that's this kind of story that I felt like I didn't see very often, particularly in the more classic fantasies that I've always loved. And so in order to make her feel more authentically like she was coming from that place of experience, I did put in some very directly borrowed from Chinese culture and borrowed from Chinese history things. The tea that she drinks, is rolled pearl jasmine tea. And I was drinking rolled pearl jasmine tea as I was writing her drinking tea. And there's an item, a traditional jade hairpin, a tea that is from Chinese tradition when girls would receive one when they came of age at 15. And that plays a fairly significant role in her story. But really, I think less the specific borrowed language, some words, some phrases, some aspects of her homeland. It was less those specific instances and more the feeling of being out of place and a feeling like she doesn't belong in either, and questioning, has she become more of this new kingdom that she lives in, or has she lost the language of her parents because she's lived there for so long and tried to learn this new language? Those things were where I feel like I injected the most of my own experience.
Yeah, that makes me think about how transformation is also a big theme in our books, and especially in The Fox Wife. I feel like Snow literally can transform. So she's constantly navigating that world, right, between fitting in this household or another. I mean, were you trying to connect a particular theme when you wrote about choosing a POV of the fox?
Wow, I just like animals. Actually, I spent, before I was ever published, I spent 8 years writing a terrible novel about an elephant who was a detective. So you can see there's a common theme between animals and detectives. And people would ask me things like, is this a children's book? I'd be like, no, it's a serious literary novel in first-person pachyderm. I'm sorry, I just really like animals. But I do think one of the questions which, after 3 books, has sort of emerged is, the question is always, what makes us human? And the struggle between, the difference between man and beast is something that people have been thinking about for like thousands of years. What makes us human, as Aristotle says, what is the good? What is the part of us that separates us from beasts? And I've always really liked stories about foxes. They do actually occupy that strange space between civilization and wilderness. In the green room, we were actually talking about urban foxes who like to go through your garbage. So, but I think that question of what is meaningful, what is human, why we do things, what sets us apart, that is an eternal question. And the role of the fox, particularly in East Asian mythology, the shape changer who takes on the appearance of a very attractive man or woman, is also, I think, parallels to xenophobia, fears about the unknown, because many of these foxes are seen as, the language used to describe them is very similar to how we describe strangers, as in the fox takes on the form of a human, but it's not human. It is a beast, And I think this tension between the known and the unknown, what we trust and what we distrust, is a very kind of ancient feeling that you see even now, as people feel distrustful of anyone who's not from their hometown. So,
Yeah, I also, in my own research of foxes, I think it was Pusongling, right? There's this notion that the foxes are seductive, that they're tricksters, right? That they can make humans behave in a way against their better judgment. It's almost like it's a scapegoat, right? And maybe the modern equivalent would be like vampires. I, of course, just came from Dracula today, so I do have like vampires on the brain. But I saw a footnote at the end of your author notes where it looked like a citation on the Fox research. Do you remember that?
yes, there's actually a lot of fox research. It's super interesting if anybody wants to find out more, because not only within China, but in Korea and Japan, the cult of the fox, and it is also a religion. You have to stop me because I can go on about fox research for a long time, literally go down rabbit holes. But it is super interesting. If you look at the historical significance of it, it also involves mediums who claim to speak for the gods, as well as the worship of the cult of the fox, which is animist, and precedes Buddhism, Taoism, etc. in China. I'm going to stop myself here before we go on. But it is super interesting, and there's lots to read. If you're
It's also a great segue for my next question for Aimee, which is about what kind of research did you do for The Lost Queen? I mean, we were talking earlier about how important this mythology is and how revered the legend of the Chuang sisters is, but you have to distill it down for your book.
Sure. And I think, one of the great things I think about mythology and fantasy and how it interacts, I think, with the people who read it and feel a kinship to it and feel a connection to the people is how it's interpreted for a certain generation. So what I really love about fantasy writing that involves like this history and tradition is how do you adapt it for the current generation? And so the story of the Chung sisters is so much about sisterhood, and it's about female empowerment. It's about a rebellion against the Chinese Empire for Vietnam, even if it was the Chung sisters united these villages and they ruled for 3 years. But then after 3 years, the Han Empire came back and squashed them, right? And so how do you find a redemption from that story? And so the redemption for me was they don't die. They're reincarnated, right? And they find new lives. And so it was about then drawing upon other myths that may not necessarily be within the Chung sisters, but surround it, which is where the dragons came in. I didn't realize dragons were going to come into the book.
But they're always better with dragons, right?
It's true. And so when I realized that became very much a symbol of the power that these characters had. And so to have the Chung sisters being reincarnated into my narrator, my protagonist, is a 15-year-old girl who's feeling very alienated, very disempowered in her high school, which is, I think, a feeling that is very familiar for a lot of teenagers. And so to discover that you actually are a reincarnation of like one of the most powerful women in history, but also an immortal dragon, right? Which is a spoiler, but it's okay to know that. It changes who she is, and then it kind of sets off the book. So to answer your question, the research really kind of like drew from so many different places. When you actually read the story of the Chung sisters in history, it's very dry, at least the ones I had. Do you know what I mean?
And it feels like the ending is so tragic.
Yeah. And so how do you write from there? How do you move on from there? And so it became a really good starting point of like, where can the story go on from here?
Yes. I mean, was there research that you were like, this part is so cool, but it is not making it into the book?
Yes. All the armies are all women, women soldiers. And one woman, actually one of their generals, gives birth on the battlefield, and then takes the baby, straps the baby to her back, and keeps on fighting. I love that.
That's amazing.
It is. It's amazing, but they're also in high school, so I couldn't figure out a way to incorporate that incredible general into the story. That's pretty metal.
Yeah. What about you, Yangsze? I feel like there was a lot of research that didn't make it into the book.
Yes. I think the fun thing about writing fiction is that all one's hobbies can be turned into research. So I did do a lot of, the reason I wrote this novel is because I loved stories about foxes when I was a child. And so I had a lot of fun, digging into all these things. But then you, once again, have to decide, does this make sense? Is this going to bore everybody? I think in order to keep the story moving, you really have to cut things. My novel was unfortunately very long. Before I started actually writing, I did not understand that publishers have this thing called word count. So they want you to stay within your word count for economic reasons, because they don't want to publish giant books. It costs money. And so I didn't realize that I think on average they like about 100,000 words for fiction. Middle grade, young adult goes lower. If you write space opera, it can go a little higher. And I was very slowly writing my book. And then I think about 2 years in, my long-suffering agent called me and she's like, "Where is your book?" And I said, "I have about 240,000 words and I don't have an ending yet." She said, "You need to cut this. We cannot sell this book." And I thought, oh, you're right. So, going back to your original question, there was a lot of stuff. There were a lot of side stories that I had to cut from this novel. It was very painful. But one of the things that I wanted to add were lots of stories about foxes, because part of the research I did was to also read first-person historic accounts of encounters with foxes in China and Japan from the 1800s to the 1950s. And these were so peculiar. There were a lot of journals that kept track. Maybe like, I was walking on a mountain road when I met this man and blah, blah, blah. And they're so strange because they're very disjointed. They're dreamlike fragments, and that makes them sound real. I think if you're lying, then you'd have a fantastic story and all tied up really well. So I actually wanted to put a lot of these original encounters with foxes into my book. I did manage to put a few of them in, but the rest of them had to be lost with about 100,000 words.
Yeah, I read some of those too, and they feel like hallucinations, like they dropped something and then they were high or whatever, and then they wrote it down. That's or told somebody about it. So that's how they present when you're reading these fox stories. Can I ask you about research you did for Ghost Bride? I had never heard of that custom or practice until I read the book.
Oh, okay. Yes. Sorry, I don't want to take too much time, but it's super interesting. So the Chinese belief in the afterlife and the burning of goods for your ancestors. It's basically like the Egyptians, except the Chinese afterlife is made in origami and paper and burned. And that is something I remember watching my grandmother do when I was a child. My grandmother was a devout Buddhist and also an adherent of many Chinese folk religions. And as children, I remember we would basically fold a lot of gold paper into ingots, which would represent gold in the underworld, and then she would burn it together with money. By the way, if you go into any Chinese grocery store, there will always be a section of hell money. It literally says Bank of Hell on it. So do not take these home to play with. It is not lucky, but you're supposed to burn it so the people in the afterlife can receive it. And it is just super fascinating. I'll stop here, but we can talk about it later if you want to.
Well, it's interesting because I think the first time I understood like ancestor worship was for Lunar New Year. We had set the whole table, and then my parents lit the incense, and they started putting place cards, like name cards, at the table. And I thought, what's happening? I was quite young, and they said, oh, ancestors eat first. And so that was probably the first notion I had that like, oh, maybe we're not alone and other spirits are eating with us for dinner, which, growing up, having these sort of supernatural elements in your family life seems normal until, you go to school and you realize that's not how other people have dinner, right? But I think for Ghost Bride, the bridge was that, oh, this is a living person. This isn't like the money or the fruit or whatever. It's actually like this person is going to live out their whole life married to a ghost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. So the ghost marriage often occurred between two dead people. So if Romeo and Juliet were Chinese and they died, their families would have married them posthumously and everyone would save face. But very rarely the dead married the living. And I thought about this because this is one of those stories that you hear when you're a kid and you're like doing something and then so-and-so married a dead person. So you're like, oh, whoa. It is still happening. It still occurs in Asia. From time to time, I get newspaper articles and fan mail saying, hey, this happened in Thailand last year. So it does happen for many, many reasons. Sometimes because there is, let's say, very tragically, like your fiance passed away. The other partner might be like, I will never marry, I will marry you in death, Or, as in my novel, what used to happen is because of the idea of ancestor worship and the importance of having a son or a family to burn offerings for you once you were dead. Otherwise, you would be a pauper in the afterlife, They would sometimes find a poor girl to marry the deceased son of a rich family, and then she would enter the family as a widow. Sometimes they would adopt children. They would be like, here is your son. He is however many years old. He did really well in the exams. So it is important. What you spoke about, the spirit world and the material world kind of seamlessly go together. And actually, after I'd written the novel, a friend of mine who's Singaporean did tell me, oh, did I tell you that my uncle had a ghost marriage too? And I was like, really? So it is still occurring.
Practice. It's fascinating. It does also bring into play the importance of family. Like a lot of reasons why people are doing these things is for family. And I feel like, Julie, in your book, you explore this sense of, obligation that she's running away from and then how she reconciles it. Was that intentional?
I think yes and no. So when I wrote The Teller of Small Fortunes, it was my debut novel. And honestly, I wrote it with no expectation of publication. I was writing it for me as kind of an escape. And so naturally, as authors tend to do with their first novels, they put a lot of their own story into it. It's a little bit of a cathartic sort of healing thing. And yeah, I think it's something that I imagine many children of immigrants, particularly in the U.S., can relate to. The feeling of your parents have suffered a great deal, have done a lot. My parents emigrated to the U.S. from Malaysia. My father in particular came from a very poor background. He was the first of his family to go, beyond middle school. And then he kind of taught himself English, got himself to the UK, got himself a job, et cetera, et cetera. And my parents have sacrificed constantly in order to give me and my sister the best foundation that they can for a better life.
I feel like you cannot have a panel with a lot of Asian diaspora authors without the word sacrifice coming out.
That's right. And I'm not sure we all had some variation of piano lessons and math classes and so on and so forth. But it's also a part of Chinese culture, the idea of filial piety and filial duty to your parents. They sacrifice such that you give back to them in turn when they are older, and kind of the cycle continues. And I think it's something that's so deeply ingrained in us that it's hard for that not to bleed out into the characters when the characters you're writing are ones that are close to your heart.
Yeah, I love that your character is a teller of small fortunes, only the small ones, because the big ones are really maybe scary, right? And I feel like Aimee, in your work, that notion of knowing the future or something big happening is a little bit scary for your protagonist, and that's her connection, though. It's like her heritage with her grandfather. Did you want to explore those sort of family dynamics when you were starting out writing The Lost Queen?
I think, well, the grandfather, so she has a grandfather who is a psychic, and he is able to foretell. He sees what's going to happen in the future. He sees the dragons coming. He sees all the events that are going to happen. And so, of course, in contemporary San Jose, they think he is crazy, right? They question it. And so she has to struggle with dealing with her grandfather's version of reality, which then starts entering theirs, right? My mom, so the idea of a Vietnamese psychic who can foretell things was something that was very present in my life too. When my brother and I were both born, my mother had a Vietnamese psychic make astrology charts for both of us that predicted everything. It predicted what diseases we're going to get, what we were going to do with our money, what kind of careers we were going to have, when we were going to die. And they were recorded on these little cassette tapes that my mom would listen to. And so my mom was always reminding us of them, of saying, these tapes, they told me what you were going to do. Like it became this kind of thing that she would dangle in front of me, like, I knew that was going to happen because the fortune teller told me this was going to happen. And so it was this thing that kind of hovered over me. And as a writer, you think a lot about, like, what is your free will and what is preordained. And I think that is a struggle that the characters go through. And I think that's what a lot of people go through, like, what was meant to be and what can I absolutely control. And so I wanted to play with those themes, definitely with the Vietnamese psychic in the book, and have this character who thinks that everything is preordained. And what does the protagonist do when she finally realizes she can actually have more control and she can actually write her own story?
Can I ask? I'm just curious, Aimee, how accurate were the cassette tapes?
I got, not very, but there were some things. They predicted that I was going to be terrible with money, and I'm very bad with money. And they foretold that I was going to lose a house, and I did. And it was just really weird. And I was like, I can't tell my mom that we lost the house. This was during the Great Foreclosure in 2008, when we bought right before we moved here, and then everything crashed. And I was like, I can't tell her this is going to happen. But when it did happen, my mom was like, well, it was going to happen.
The worst, I told you so.
Then it's almost like it excused you, right? Because then it's like, there is no free will. This was going to happen regardless. I mean, I have to confess, my father is one of those astrologers. So people would come from far and wide. They'd come from Hong Kong. They would have him do their birth charts, and he would never accept any payments. So our house is filled with fruit. Like, we constantly had bags of oranges and chocolates and all these things, or alcohol. My dad doesn't drink. And they were quite accurate. So I did feel like my own upbringing gave me this sort of sense that, like, there were things beyond regular science, that there were other sciences or ways of doing things. And that's why I think people have always asked me, like, Julia, why aren't you writing legal thrillers? And I was like, well, it's aside from the fact that they would be boring, right? There's also the fact that I felt like there was a lot of magic in my childhood, and that maybe there was an element of the fantastic, moving between worlds always felt sort of mystical to me.
Did your father tell your fortune?
Yes.
And did he tell you about it?
You know, he gave me my charts. He was very agitated when I was having kids, because he really wanted to make sure they were born at the lucky times, right? And then I'd say, Dad, the doctor cannot show up at 4 a.m. for this surgery for the C-section. Like, you have to pick a normal time. So I do feel like the sense of control was maybe an illusion. By the way, the baby came early and he came at 5 a.m. So he got into the lucky time period anyway. So the doctor had to wake up early and show up.
Yeah, that's so interesting because, you know, growing up in Asia, like feng shui is just really big. And you do see that tension between, does it comfort you? Does it give you control? Or is it controlling your life? So, you know, there's this constant tension. And so one of my dad's friends was a big believer in this. And he actually renovated his house according to what the feng shui
It's called geomancy. It's a science.
No, actually, we like years and years, we're like, never go in through the front door because the feng shui master said no. So for years and years, we'd have to go and visit him through the back door. He had a very large Rottweiler, and it was actually terrifying. But I did think that it's so interesting. You know, it is almost on a knife edge as to how much does it comfort you, and how much does it also control you, right?
Yeah, I do find it interesting. I'm retired now, but I was a real estate litigator for a long time, which meant that I had more than passing interest in real estate. And because my dad was also interested in feng shui, I would always be shunned. Like a client would show me like the construction plans or whatever, and I'd be like, well, why is the door there? Don't you know that this? And then I thought, okay, they don't know, Julia. I can't mention it. You know, maybe they just need a lot of sage, right? Okay, we have about 3 minutes, and Yangsze, I wanted to ask you, because you told me the story once about the call you got from your agent when Netflix called, and I would just love to hear more about it. I'm sure our audience would too.
Well, okay, I'm happy to tell you the story because, so my first novel turned into a Netflix series, and people have asked me things like, how did you feel about the script and blah? I was like, no, I was just very, very happy. So what happened was I was pushing my shopping cart around in Trader Joe's. A lot of things have happened to me in Trader Joe's, maybe because I'm there all the time. And I got this, this call from my agent saying, by the way, Netflix is interested in your book. And I was so thrilled. I was like, give it to them. Tell them they can have it for free. And then she's like, stop. This is why you have an agent, right? So I was like, oh, yeah. And so they did. They made The Ghost Bride. I think it might still be on Netflix. It is a Chinese drama, and therefore all my mother's dreams come true. The story is completely different from the book because Netflix had said, hey, we want to take the universe of the book and we want to change it. And at which point I was like, yes, take it. You can have it. And so it was super thrilling. I don't think it will ever happen again. In fact, my agent was like, I'm surprised this happened. I was like, yeah. Because she's like, no, because normally they will not do historical fiction and they will not do like the world of the dead because that costs money. It costs a lot of money to make the green screens and, people fly around and stuff. And I was like, oh, and she's like, don't you know that what they like is contemporary romance, because then you can just film it in a coffee shop and saves you lots of money. And I said, oh yeah, okay. I mean, I clearly had no clue. I still have no clue. Sometimes people ask me, can you tell me? I was like, no, I have no idea. Look, this was my reaction. You can take it, have it. So that's what happened. It was exciting.
Yangsze, I think what Netflix really needs is an elephant detective series.
Oh yeah, that would go down really well. I had to give up that book because my detective literally could not fit in the room. And so it's like, I spent like, for all of you who are aspiring writers, I want to share with you that it's okay to spend 8 years on a book that doesn't go anywhere. And also to realize at the end, like, oh dear, because it was so hard. Like, I was like, he can't even view the body because he's outside the building. And then at which point I said, his trunk. I mean, but you can't see through a trunk. You can smell. I was like, this is just so difficult. And then I said to my husband, I think I shall have a dog assistant. And at which point he said, look, stop with the animals. We just go back to humans. Anyway.
But it looks so good in a trench coat.
I mean, I like the dog companion idea. I'm a fan. Okay, so it is time for Q&A, and I believe there's a mic in the back for questions.
Hello. Yes, I guess this is broadly for the panel, although Yangsze, it was kind of your story about fox research that got me thinking of it. Stories of foxes exist in most cultures across the world, although in very different ways. And it's true that a given story, even if the same broad arcs or structures are the same, it will differ or be similar in very unique ways. And I guess my question broadly to the panel is, when you're bringing in a story that draws meaningfully from a particular cultural experience or a cultural story, how do you kind of deal with the fact that readers might be coming in with a very different expectation about what that myth or what that archetype looks like and how that will play out, merely because the stories they've seen have always looked a certain way? Does that or does that not factor in at all? And if so, how?
Happy to start. Yeah, I don't really care. Or said another way, I think because I know everybody is coming in with such different expectations, it sort of relieves the pressure on me to have to cater to any particular one. And so, especially, like I said, my first book, I wrote it without knowing that it was going to be published and be read by anybody other than my poor husband. And so, yeah, it wasn't something that was sort of in my head what the expectations were. And in fact, I went into writing it wanting to subvert some particular expectations, taking sort of this classic adventuring party D&D style novel that people would, expect to follow a certain track, and then here and there putting a little bit of a whimsical twist on it in order to, make it fit a little bit more kind of the cozy mold that I wanted in my head.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like authors, we're all wild, right? Like we get in there and then our vampires can sparkle. It's fine.
I think it's really interesting. Like, I think readers' expectations and the reader's experience is so varied. I think what my favorite books have been are books that have really surprised me reading it. Like, I didn't know I was going to feel this intensely. I'm thinking right now about Ishiguro's Remains of the Day. I didn't know I was going to cry over an English butler taking a road trip, right? And yet that's where we went. And I think some of the very best books, the best writing, takes you to unexpected places. I think readers come in with, I think my ideal reader is someone who's just really open, just this idea of like, where are we going to go? And I think when you come in with, I think, preconceived notions and expectations, those kind of become like shackles a little bit. Like, it prevents you from enjoying the story. And I assume when a reader opens a book, they want to believe. They want to engage with the writing and just surprise them. This is my hope, because I very much am taking this Vietnamese myth and doing what I want with it, not caring what is the actual tradition, because that's what, as writers, we do in that next generation of that storytelling, is like, how do we make these stories new? How do we make them resonate for readers today?
Well, I'm going to answer your question specifically about foxes, because that's all I know about. But I actually think that is an interesting question, and it's been interesting to hear everybody's thoughts. But on the matter of foxes, there is a lot of lore, and I had to make the book work on two levels for two different audiences. This is my issue with all my books too. In my mind, there is an Asian audience which is very familiar about this. Because the cult of the fox, which probably originated in Inner Mongolia, okay, I'll stop myself, and then went on to China and Japan and Korea, is remarkably similar, and it is very well known. And at the same time, I had an audience of English-speaking people who probably like, I don't know what the heck this is, and I don't even know where Manchuria is on a map. So it is a difficult thing to bring a story that gives enough feeling of the world without boring you. And I actually had to think about that throughout the entire novel. In fact, when I have been on book tour in Asia, the questions I get are different the questions in America, because people are like, did you think of blah, blah, blah? Were you referring to this legend? No, don't you think actor so-and-so would be the best person for this? I was like, yes, he's very handsome. But it is, and so when I was writing the novel, I did put in a lot of Easter eggs for people who are familiar with the legend of the fox. So the beginning of the novel itself is a joke. It is a stereotype of the fox story in which late one evening a beautiful woman comes in to seduce you while you are taking your exams, which is a male fantasy. Like, look, I couldn't do all my exams because this woman came to seduce me, you know? So that's a joke. A lot of the things that happen to the foxes are inside jokes. And yet at the same time, I had to make sure that the story reads well enough that you don't feel I'm flailing around. I felt this in some sci-fi novels. So I did not read novel 3 to 5. So I do not know what happened to the planet Perelandra. So you've got to kind of continually work with that. And I think, just have to try your best. So,
Yeah, I do think that anchoring something universal, like The Fox Wife is a story about a mother, at least to me as a reader. So that's a relatable anchor. So everything else might have either a subversion of the trope or a callback, the Easter egg to the trope. But the thing that's keeping me in this story is, hey, this is about her emotional healing, and then this other gentleman, this detective, and his long-lost love, his childhood sweetheart. Like, that's the parallel story. So I feel like bringing those universal themes is how we keep the reader engaged with us, even as we try or experiment with something else. Right.
Can you hear me? Okay. I have a lot of questions, but I'll try to stay focused. Do either of the writers or yourself host writing workshops, or possibly consider that as a resource for aspiring writers or just people within your community?
I'm a teacher, so I'm teaching a workshop right now. So yeah. So yes, I do teach writing workshops. Was there something else for that? Or yeah, about for your community. So I'm part of the Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network, and we host workshops in order to foster the literature of the Southeast Asian diaspora. And so I think that's actually really important. I think some of the best writing workshops, like when I first started in studying writing, it was challenging trying to workshop my writing and trying to develop my writing with people who are not familiar with my culture, who would try their best, but, often make really maybe, not the most sensitive suggestions, like add more food, or, I don't understand this. I don't, and learning not to have to necessarily write not to dumb down your writing, and to write for an audience that can do their own research if they need to look up a term, right? That's really important. I think it's much better now. I mean, I first started doing writing workshops 25 years ago as a student. I feel like it's much different now. It's much more diverse. There's more opportunities to take workshops with, and I think readers and writers are actually just much more aware about the sensitivity of like doing your own research when you come to a piece and understanding what you need to do to be able to critique it. So there are those workshops out there. There's not only DVAN, but there's also VONA, which is specifically a workshop for writers of color. There's also Kundiman, which is based in New York. And I think there are some amazing writing groups, even in the Bay Area.
I was going to say, I think the Grotto also has a number of workshops throughout the year, and their artists in residence are usually quite diverse, too.
Hello. I'm just really curious about sort of the maybe tension between like gender and tradition in your works, because especially, I mean, you guys spoke a lot about tradition and about bringing in your own familial heritage to your work, but also as modern writers in today's world, I'm really curious if you ever felt a tension between what, like the themes you wanted to explore, the traditions that they came from, and maybe if you used fantasy and magic to sort of bridge or correct certain traditions, how did that come about, or what did you do? And if so, was that a tension for you as writers, trying to at once honor your backgrounds, but also write the stories that you're interested in writing?
I did encounter that. Our protagonist is, she's running away from her family, right? This is the premise, that she's hiding out in San Francisco from her powerful magical clan until a Shinigami shows up collecting on a blood debt incurred by her mother. So there's a little bit of generational trauma built in there. But I think after we were done writing it, I thought, oh, maybe I've made a terrible mistake. I've tackled this notion of like duty to the family, which is a very non-Western, I think, like collectivist type of obligation. But what I didn't realize was that I had accidentally tapped into like eldest daughter POV, so it ended up working out okay in the end.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this directly answers your question, but I suppose my second book, The Keeper of Magical Things, unlike The Teller of Small Fortunes, does not feature an Asian-coded character. And when I was writing it, I remember being a little bit worried, actually, about whether or not I should be writing another book with another Asian immigrant-style character, because maybe that's what my publisher, my audience would expect from me, being an Asian-American writer, you know. But I feel like I had to force myself out of that box and say, no, like this second story I want to tell is not about the immigrant experience and is not about my Asian heritage, and I shouldn't feel obligated to keep writing about that. And so instead I got to write about some sapphic lady mages, like wrangling some talking teapots in a magical village, and that was fun. And a flying cat. Yeah, the cat dragon's very important. And so I guess, in a way, I mean, the relation to gender there, all of my main characters thus far have been women, I suppose for a variety of reasons, but finding the space to write about things that aren't necessarily about the culture and the heritage, and sharing the same ethnicity as me, I think has been welcome.
I think growing up, the books that I loved to read when I was younger, my mom was a social worker, and across the street was a public library. And that was my babysitter after school. She would take her lunch hour, pick me up from school, and then she would drop me off at the library until she got off of work at like 5:30 or sometimes 7:30. And so books were what I had, and I loved them. I loved to read, and I read very few books growing up about Asian characters, specifically about Vietnamese characters. And then when I found them, they meant so much to me. They meant everything. I remember those books so well. I think there's something very validating about, even though I found myself, relating to, because you're forced to, not forced to, but you have to relate to characters that are not of your own culture because that's not what you're reading. But when you find them, it feels like a revelation. So when I wanted to start writing, I was really excited about writing about people who look like me. Writing about my family, writing about my community, bringing voice to a community that I loved so much, but I felt had been so silenced, right? So that was really important to me. In terms of female voices, yeah, I think they're incredibly important. Like even before, all my books have featured, I think, young female characters, and I think it's because, I don't know, when I was growing up, I felt I was scared of speaking up so much. I was scared of being mocked. I watched my parents be silenced a lot because people couldn't understand their accents. And there's something incredibly joyous for me to be able to write about very different characters of Vietnamese descent and writing about the culture. Like I write about Vietnamese American culture because I want to explore it. It's important to me. And so I love to be able to play in that land. And of course, that doesn't mean that's the only thing I can write. But right now, that's what gives me the most inspiration. If I'm going to continue to do that, I'm not sure. But right now, that's where I am.
Well, thanks for letting me go last because I had to think about this for a while. I think, my experience is actually growing up in Asia and coming to America. And so to me, it's, it's part of a lived experience. And actually, when you were talking about traditions, I was actually thinking the person that I had to argue with the most was my mother, because she was like, why are you
you writing about ghosts? Why don't you write about cheerful things? So, because there's this whole like, why must you write? And then, when I did my second novel, which is Night Tiger, about weird tigers, she's like, why man-eating tigers? So when you ask your questions, I actually thinking like, I can think about my mum. And so I think, and then, there is a lot of, we talked briefly about feng shui and lucky numbers. That was a lot of the Night Tigers about lucky numbers, and that is actually the lived experience of many of my contemporaries and friends, and it's just part of life in Asia, because many things are, we were talking in the green room about this, puns. So as you're speaking Chinese, you're hearing the homophones for lots of lucky or unlucky things. So I was like, yeah, I don't know, that's part of, the interesting thing to me about coming to America was, and then when I wrote my first novel, was the question of what genre does this novel belong to? And I was really surprised because I was talking to a bunch of literary agents. They're like, what is this? Where will we put this? Is this fantasy? Is this, is this magical realism? And I think that in most other parts of the world, in which I think the spiritual and the material mingle seamlessly. It is not just in Asia, Latin America, etc. It might just be it is the non-scientific rationalism part of the world. It is simply part of your life. And it's quite normal to be like, and by the way, did you put out some cigarettes for your grandpa who's deceased on your way out? Otherwise, he's going to be very unhappy with you. So that blended seamlessly together. And it did actually make me think that coming to America to me looked like the land of myths. When I arrived, the first time I saw a big yellow taxi, I was like, taxi driver, I want to touch this taxi. And my friends were like, stop, stay away from, the first time I saw a diner was like, this looks like Edward Hopper's pictures. So it reminds me like the world of the imagination, the world of the other is always changing. So it's super interesting.
Thank you, everybody. I think I've got the signal from...
Thank you so much. Thank you all for spending your evening with us and helping us celebrate storytelling, tradition, and imagination during this season of Lunar New Year. A huge thank you to our panelists, Yangsze Choo, Julie Leong, and Aimee Phan, for sharing their insights, creativity, and the many ways cultural memory, folklore, and heritage shape magical fiction today. And a special thanks to Julia V. for guiding such a thoughtful, engaging conversation and for bringing both warmth and curiosity to the discussion. Thank you all again for being here. Let's give a round of applause to our authors. And have a wonderful evening.